Hey everyone, Seth here. Hope you're doing well today. In this video, I want to talk about open theism and how it might relate in some weird ways to Calvinism. So bear with me here as I try to flesh this out. I'm going to make this a little more of an unscripted video, and hopefully I won't start rambling. But again, just bear with me a little bit on this video because I'm going to try to connect some dots that I think maybe a lot of people haven't considered. Open theism really is becoming more popular in evangelical circles to the point where I saw a video where Mike Winger over at Bible Thinker said it is going to be more of an issue to address in the church. It's not going away. It's only going to grow in the future. I personally think that it is a reaction to Calvinism. Whether the people who embrace an open view currently are former Calvinists or have been under Calvinistic influences, I don't know for sure. But I do see the growing embrace of open theism as a reaction to our, what I'm going to call Calvinist overlords, and the hard determinism taught by them. A lot of these very prominent and influential Calvinist leaders. My hope is that those who abandon Calvinism aren't going to become faithless, that they will not abandon the faith, but the ones who do leave, I have a strong suspicion that they're going to end up in open theism. And there's all kind of variations of open theism, some very subtle forms of it, some very radical forms of it as well, which I believe compromise biblical truth. But nonetheless, nature abhors a vacuum. Some of which are already making some waves in certain parts of the dark web of the internet. Shout out to Warren McGrew at Idol Killer, who, as far as I can tell, holds to what he calls a dynamic omniscience view. I hope I'm accurate in describing that, which is within the spectrum of openness theology, and he's also an ex-Calvinist. Mark Driscoll, not an open theist as far as I know, but he is an ex-Calvinist. Austin Fisher, he wrote a book on no longer being part of the Young, Restless, and Reformed. I think he actually called it Young, Restless, and No Longer Reformed. I've seen or listened to a little bit of a debate he had with James White on Unbelievable Radio with Justin Brierley. It was pretty interesting. He talked a little bit about foreknowledge there. He's an ex-Calvinist. I think we're going to see more and more people defecting from Calvinism. And again, my contention is going to be that a lot of them are probably going to trend toward, to one degree or another, toward open theism. I think Calvinism is honestly beginning to enter the death throes of dying under its own weight. As I said a moment ago, nature abhors a vacuum, and the most probable theological system that would fill that vacuum, because we're talking about foreknowledge here, right, is probably the open theist view. But my hope is that a lot of good balanced Bible teachers, like a Mike Winger, can help guide some Christians on the internet, because that's where this battle is fought, right? I mean, this is where these things crop up, is all over the internet. This is the place of information. We're not going to the library and checking out books on open theism, right, or Calvinism. We're looking on the internet. But I hope some solid guys like that can at least help steer people away from the radical forms of it, which also I think end up maligning the character of God, just as extreme forms of Calvinism malign the character of God. The determinist view, honestly, has just become too dominant for the past 2 decades, and the young, restless, and reformed, they're burning out on Calvinism, right? Much like you could say their spiritual forebears burned out on New England Puritan Calvinism, and they either went the way of Unitarianism or Transcendentalism, look up the history of it, or they stayed within orthodoxy. through the New School Presbyterianism of men like Albert Barnes and, dare I say, Charles Finney, though I know he's hugely controversial. I think the Reformed camp could possibly head much of this off if they would just take a softer approach to foreknowledge. But I'm not optimistic that they will. The Reformed love to say the slogan, Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda, if you have heard that term before, which means the church reformed is always reforming, but they don't actually believe it, right? They don't practice it. They're still stuck in the battles of the 16th century and refuse to take the Bible on its own terms. If you don't believe me, subscribe to a prominent Reformed magazine, which shall go nameless here, but you'll still see them arguing about the Council of Trent. Okay, it's pretty unbelievable. And the Reformed, they love seminaries, but they don't love Bible colleges. All right, I'm gonna talk a little bit about Bible colleges in a minute. They love theological terms instead of biblical terms. Okay, they quote Augustine, the Reformers, and the Confessions of Faith, but they refuse to quote the Bible when it does not fit with their system. And this kind of scripture, approach to scripture rather, and the heart of God, I believe is pushing people away from their system. It's becoming less and less convincing to a lot of people, and hence why you see more and more guys leaving Calvinism. One thing to remember about Calvinists in all this, when I talk about Calvinist overlords, and I'll talk about maybe who those are in just a moment, is that the Calvinists are in the minority. They are not the majority view of the church. Even in America, where it seems so prevalent, but also throughout the world, it is not the majority. They are in the minority. But they do a really good job of convincing a lot of hearers. They intimidate, sometimes they bully, and even shame believers into their system by calling them man-centered. If you've ever encountered that before or had somebody call you that, you know what I'm talking about. So basically a nice way of saying you're a humanist, right? You'll be called a semi-Pelagian. That term's thrown around like crazy. Another way of saying that you're either a heretic or you're very close to it. They control all the top conservative seminaries, and they've largely gone unchallenged in popular Christian media. They even get a lot of positive press for some of the good things they do say. I mean, it's not like all of them are saying negative things. A lot of good stuff comes out of some of our leading Calvinists out there. But when it comes to specifically Calvinism and the determinism that they teach, I think is what is so damaging and causing a lot of confusion in a lot of minds, and hence why more and more you're going to see defect from it. So the main figures who I would call Calvinist overlords, and I know overlord kind of sounds like a really negative term, but I think you know what I mean when I say that, because that is essentially how they function in society, whether they like it or not. But those main figures who helped usher in the sort of new Calvinists in the past 20 years are men like John Piper, R.C. Sproul, Al Mohler, Ligon Duncan, Alistair Begg, and James White. And with the exception of James White, I have not seen any of these guys challenged in their Calvinism in any kind of open debate or open discussion by a non-Calvinist. All these men have great character, so I'm not maligning their character or their intentions. I just think their teaching is in error. I mean, John Piper has one of the greatest Christian forms of character that I've seen. The humble way he lives, his passion, his kindness, his gentleness, he's just an amazing man. But I just think that his theology, his hard determinism, is an error and is really confusing a lot of people. But I can't think of a single time that John Piper has ever debated Calvinism or his determinist positions of any kind in an informal way, in a formal way whatsoever. And this is a problem, right? I mean, how can anyone be balanced if they are rarely ever challenged, right? Um, I have the, I bet that if John Piper were to engage in a lengthy discussion or debate with a really capable non-Calvinist, you would see the holes exposed in his theology, right? I saw one video one time of John MacArthur being challenged on predestination. It was some kind of Q&A, semi-vivid memory of it. I'm sure I could find it if I looked it up. If I do end up finding it, I'll post a link to it in the show notes so you can look at it. But his answer was pretty weak, and it was kind of squirmy and very deflective, right? And I think that is a common denominator when Calvinists are challenged very forthrightly by a non-Calvinist. And it wasn't really until Leighton Flowers began responding point by point, video by video, even going back in sort of archives of old videos of John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul and James White and John Piper. It wasn't until then did these men's teachings really face a lot of public scrutiny. Credit also goes to Mike Winger. Though he doesn't necessarily address some of these guys point by point, he's put out some videos with very intelligent and widely listened to responses to Calvinism. And I wish he'd do more. I wish he'd do a whole series on it because he's very capable at responding to it. I've also noticed another guy named Joe Schimmel, who I followed years ago before I became a Calvinist at Good Fight Radio Network. He has a home church called Blessed Hope Chapel. I think it's in Simi Valley, California. He's put out some good stuff. Even recently I've seen on his podcast and maybe some preaching. Some of you might know Joe Schimmel's work through his docu-series, They Sold Their Souls for Rock and Roll, which I cannot recommend enough. It will knock you over flat. But I found online on his website a teaching series called Refuting Calvinism, and it is excellent. So I can't recommend it enough as well. Excellent series. So how can the Calvinist overlords, as I call them, get the message that they need to rethink their positions? I mean, first, stop going to their seminaries. And if you're a non-Calvinist and you want a good theological education, find a solid Bible college or discipleship program. There are plenty out there that are very biblical. You'll be more than educated enough, and you won't be saddled with massive amounts of debt as you would at maybe some of the higher end Reformed seminaries, right? You'll probably come out a better thinker and more well-rounded and have a little more fire in you for reaching the lost because you won't be boxed in by the Calvinist system. And then second, stop frequenting their websites or sharing articles from their websites and blogs. This only ups their search results. Ministries like Desiring God, Grace to You, the Gospel Coalition, Got Questions, Ligonier Ministries, all Calvinists, right? All these are Calvinists, and they dominate the search results. Anytime you put in a keyword search into Google about a controversial topic from the Bible, especially if it's related to salvation. And all these websites and these guys, they have some really good other stuff, right? But when it comes to soteriology, they miss the mark, right? And it seems interesting enough that like all of the non-Calvinist answers, if you were to type these things in, they get relegated to kind of page 2 of Google search results. So it's kind of funny and sad at the same time. Sort of reminds me of how whenever you type in something else controversial into a search about something, say, political, all the mainstream media outlets will pop up. And then you kind of got to keep searching, or you might have to go onto DuckDuckGo to find alternative opinions on it, right? So Calvinists control the narrative. Make no mistake, they control the narrative. But again, remember, they are in the minority. They are not the majority, okay? Thankfully, related to this, I am seeing more and more of Leighton Flowers videos at Soteriology 101 A lot of his videos and articles are populating when searching for things related to salvation, questions related to salvation. And they are great responses to the Calvinist position. So another kudos out to Leighton Flowers and for those who help him at Soteriology 101. Third, I want to say if you're an ex-Calvinist, get on YouTube and make a video articulating your testimony of going into and out of Calvinism. I mean, if you think you're not that articulate with your words, just type out a manuscript and read it to the camera. Who cares? It's probably only going to be the cage stage Calvinists, the trolls, who are going to judge you anyway, and you don't need to pay them any attention. But we need more people who can articulate a traditionalist view. Whether you're a former Calvinist or not, take it to the airwaves, right? I mean, it doesn't cost you anything. Most of you have a camera on your laptop probably or somewhere on your phone. Share your testimony of leaving Calvinism. Or if you are a gifted Bible teacher or not, just give it a try. Get out there and try to start breaking down things and deconstructing Calvinism, right? The battleground is in large part on the internet. And the internet is not going anywhere, right? I think it would also be really powerful if a certain prominent Calvinist pastor or seminary professor would come out honestly rejecting the Calvinism that they just cannot hold on to any longer. It would take a lot of guts to do this, but I think it would jar a lot of people in a good way to reconsider the Reformed system. So if anyone watching this knows somebody who is on the fence and or maybe is in a sort of prominent position who is known as a Calvinist but no longer holds to it, encourage him to come out and reject it and publicly and give his reasons why. I think it would be very powerful for the church to hear. My encouragement to everyone, saying a lot of this, is don't be intimidated any longer by Calvinist wild claims of having a man-centered theology. All right, it's just a way to intimidate you. I know, honestly, that was what kept me hanging on to Calvinism before I finally decided to reject it. Was as soon as I think I could finally say, you know what, I just can't hold this anymore. I'd hear one popular teacher, I won't name him, say this is man-centered theology. This is the difference between man-centered theology and God-centered theology. And so I would recoil and just keep holding on. And finally, I just got to a point, I just said, you know what, I don't really care what he says. He can call it man-centered, whatever. I'm just going to go with what the Bible says. So don't be intimidated, and because here's why. Calvinists, honestly, I think they know their system is weak, because whenever you see one really get pressed by someone who is capable at pressing them, they squirm, right? They fumble, they either deflect, or they'll do the opposite and they'll double down and say things like God decreed the rape of children, which if you don't believe me, if you look at some hard determinists, they're going to say essentially that, okay? When evil happens, it is by God's decree. Pretty sickening, pretty unbelievable, but that's just hard determinism for you. So I mentioned open theism in the beginning of this video, and I've said a lot just about Calvinism, haven't really kind of swung back to talk about how it relates and the dots I want to connect to it. So what does that have to do with it? So open theism, again, is likely going to be sort of the new frontier of evangelicalism, at least on the internet. The new Calvinists, I believe, are going to make up a good portion, if not the majority, of future open theists, because I think more and more guys are just going to abandon Calvinism. People make whiplash reactions to the systems that they hold to a lot of times, to their overlords, right? It's just typical human nature, right? It's not necessarily for all, but certainly for most that they're going to have a sort of knee-jerk reaction and maybe overreact. And so what is that going to end up into is some form of open theism. Probably a lot of them are going to go into extreme forms of it. which I want to caution against. So what do you think Calvinism was, right? It was a reaction. It was a reaction to the seeker-sensitive, low church, weak preaching, anti-intellectual, squishy evangelicalism of the 80s and 90s. If any of you watching this grew up like I did in some very nominal Southern Baptist church growth type atmospheres, mega church, you probably understand how you could be attracted to Calvinism, right? The seriousness of it, the high view of the sovereignty of God, at least according to how they define it. But it was also a product of the information age, right? People never had really heard of Calvinism. It was kind of this small thing, and R.C. Sproul was working little by little and got bigger and bigger, got on the radio with Renewing Your Mind, and was making a lot of headway with it. And then you had men like John Piper come on the scene, getting into mainstream circles, and then it just started exploding. It became cool. It sort of took on a certain bravado, and some Calvinists can be very convincing in their exegesis, and if these passages are taken in isolation, right? But as we know and we've seen through other videos, context is key, right? Context is key. And I want to say about open theism, some variations of open theism are very stimulating. They're very challenging. I mean, I've been watching and listening to some videos, but there are some extreme versions of it. And to the point where I've heard one guy say that God theoretically could sin. And that's a huge turnoff. And I think taking at face value in the Bible is completely unbiblical. But nonetheless, what happens is, interestingly enough, it falls into the same error of Calvinism, of the determinist, or maybe the hard determinist, that it maligns the character of God, right? So it's just a sort of slingshot reaction back in the other direction. So I think you get my point in this video. Forgive me if I rambled a little bit, but I guess I want to say mainly that I'm making a bold prediction that open theists are going to be former Calvinists, right? The ones in the future who we're going to see becoming open theists, that sort of new frontier, the new battleground, a lot of those guys, most I think actually are going to be ex-Calvinists. So just kind of be prepared. I think that's where things are headed. But anyway, I think that's all I got for today. If you like this video, please share it. Hit the subscribe button and the bell so you can get notified of new videos as they come out. And also don't forget to visit a website that I put together. It's at noncalvinistarchive.com, where you'll find it's just an aggregation of resources related to all things non-Calvinism. Lots of videos, some MP3s, some articles. I think you'll find it very helpful. And that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching, and God bless.